Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Mick Napier. I'm speaking on behalf of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Most weeks we try to interview people every week, but we sometimes have a gap. But this week I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Gilbert Achcar. We want to speak to people, we want to have conversations with individuals we think can contribute something significant to the discussion over how to deliver effective solidarity to the beleaguered people of Palestine. So this afternoon, Professor Achcar is an academic at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, where he teaches, or he's Professor of Development Studies and International Relations. He's the author of several books which I've read. One, The People Want, which I forget the rest of the title, which is an analysis of the Arab Springs, the uprisings across the Arab world. He's the author of The Arabs and the Holocaust, which I read last week and would wish, if we have extra time, to move to discuss that. Professor Achcar lived most of his life in the Middle East, in Lebanon, but he's enjoyed a distinguished career in France and Britain since then. Gilbert, a big warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, mate. Thank you for the invitation.
Gilbert, when I look at the Arab world or the Middle East, divided between rival warlords, imperialism dominating and causing intense suffering to the people in Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Libya and so on, I think about how debased and degenerate was China in the 1920s, also under the rule of rival imperialisms, but it couldn't last forever. Do you think that parallel is at all useful? And if Arabs manage a renaissance or series of revolutions across the Middle East, will they be able to, how can they expel this foreign domination, which causes so much intense suffering for people? Can you comment on that, Gilbert?
Yeah, well, you know, the historical analogy doesn't really, I mean, it's not really helpful in this case because this is a very different history. And whereas China was subjugated by a number of foreign powers throughout its, let's say, modern history until the victory of the revolution. So basically until 1949. We are speaking of the Middle East in the period after that, that is in the period after the Second World War and after the First Arab-Israeli War and the creation of the State of Israel. And if you look at history since then, you see that actually there was in the 50s and 60s a very powerful nationalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist movement in the region, which, I mean, the best or the most prestigious and important representative of that was the Egypt of Gamal Abdel Nasser. As you know, he nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, which led Britain with France and Israel to launch what was called the tripartite aggression against Egypt at that time. And they had to withdraw without achieving anything because the United States at that point stood against them and demanded an end to the aggression, along with Moscow, actually. And so that was a big failure, and that enhanced tremendously the prestige of Nasser, who went on, of course, through several years of rule in Egypt, including left-wing radicalization in the social economic sense. This led to a wave of nationalism in the region, which triumphed in several countries, actually. The Iraqi monarchy, which was British connected, created by the British, was overthrown in 58. So 2 years after the 56 war. In Syria,
I think the CIA at that time. Sorry, I think the CIA at that time said Baghdad was the most dangerous place in the world. I think for imperialism.
I'm not aware of this particular statement. No, it wasn't. I mean, the enemy number one of the U.S. and Britain and France and all this was Egypt during this whole period. Egypt was really a key country in the let's say anti-colonial and anti-imperial movement in Asia and Africa. It played a key role. It was seen by I mean, from Washington. It was, especially in the 60s, it looked like some kind of equivalent of Cuba, but at a much bigger scale because it's a bigger country, very much larger, and with a much larger population than Cuba. So yeah, so you had a heyday of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial nationalism in the region in the 60s. And then things started to unravel after that. So you see the history is very different. So we had already a peak reached in the 60s. And it's no coincidence or surprise, I would say, that what was crucial in bringing that to an end was the state of Israel. That is, the war launched by Israel in 1967 against Egypt and Syria, plus Jordan, in order to invade, occupy the West Bank, that is the remaining part of Palestine. Those 22% of British Mandate Palestine that the state of Israel had not conquered in 1948, which means Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. So those were occupied in 67, but that was in the framework of a war against the two main or the two most radical countries of that time in the region, Egypt and the Syrian regime of that time, of 67. Of course, this was also the first war actually launched by Israel, which was backed by the United States. As I said, the previous war. Sorry.
Can I ask you a question? In '56, Eisenhower really smacked Britain, France, and Israel when they tried to when they invade Egypt. But 11 years later, when Israel smashes these Arab armies and makes the region safe for the West, in a sense, what had changed? Why had America not supported Israel in '56, but then rejoiced in 1967? It's only 11 years later.
Well, what had changed is the radicalization of Egypt and of the nationalist wave in the region, right? And that became very alarming for Washington. In '56, Washington was still playing the card of the anti-colonial, anti-traditional colonial power, there to displace the French and the British, and therefore exploiting the hatred for French and British rule that you had in the region, as everywhere where you had French and British colonialism, and trying, to get in that place. But then Washington realized, especially during the 60s, when you had this left-wing radicalization of nationalism, that it was actually losing ground to the advantage of the Soviet Union, because these countries, when splitting from the Western system, would go towards Moscow to get help, and Moscow was happy to oblige in this respect. And so this even led to the point when the pressure of Nasser's Egypt compelled the United States to evacuate what was one of its most important air bases outside the United States, which was located in the Saudi Kingdom, in the heart of the oil province in the eastern part of the Saudi Kingdom. And Washington had to leave this base, evacuate the base in 1962, under the pressure, because of the pressure of Nasser's Egypt condemning the Saudis for hosting on their territory such a base. So the Saudis had to request from Washington to evacuate it. So at that point, the United States realized that, I mean, Egypt became, you know, the main concern, the obsession, I would say, of US foreign policy. And therefore, it became natural to regard Israel as an ally. And therefore, from the mid-60s, you have a shift. Until then, Washington was embargoing the region when it comes to weapons sales, armament. From the mid-60s onwards, Washington started providing Israel with sophisticated weaponry and weapons. And that was just before the 1967 war. In the 67 war, I mean, as I said, that was the first war which was backed by Washington. Although most of the Israeli weaponry at that point were still from Germany and France, because Western Germany and France from the 50s and in the 60s had been the main providers of funding and weapons to the Israeli state. So this changed.
Can I just check that? Can I just check that, Gilbert? I'm not very good at statistics, but I remember seeing a graph of US aid and arms sales to Israel, and it seemed to me so dramatic that it was fairly modest until 1967, and then it rises quite different curve afterwards. Does that support the argument that Israel is was seen as a strategic asset, able to crush Arab nationalism, and therefore worth
that's
investing in?
Yeah, I think this is indisputable that Israel, since the mid-60s and especially since the 67 war, when Israel proved to be such a successful Sparta in the Middle East, such a country with, I mean, the Israeli left wing used to say Israel is not a state with an army, it's an army with a state, right? By the way, there's a book that just came out by Haim Rashid on it's a Verso book on the Israeli army as the very central role of the military in the Israeli state. And also, since I'm mentioning a book, there's an excellent book also by Daniel Marveski on German-Israeli relation that came out a few months ago. It's the first book that explores this side of history which people ignore, that is how much crucial and central Western Germany has been in the 50s and 60s for the funding and the build-up in general of the Israeli state. You know, okay. So to get back to what we were saying, yes, indeed, after 67, it became really. I mean, you had a radical, qualitative shift, and Israel became entered into a strategic alliance with the United States that is going on until now. And the dramatic change in aid that you mentioned is due to the fact that you started having also state aid, because before that, money coming to Israel from the United States was, from pro-Israel groups, Jewish or non-Jewish, whatever, but pro-Israel groups were mostly at that time Jewish groups would send money, or Jewish capitalists would send money to the Israeli state. Then after that, you had, in addition to this kind of money, you had state funding, US state funding. And now, of course, until now, it's been now for a very long time, very long period of history, Israel is the #1 recipient of US funding, which is essentially military funding, in the sense that the United States, it's like if the United States were just giving weapons for free for Israel, because they allocate a few $1 billion every year to the Israeli state, which actually are used to import weapons. So it's also an indirect way for the US government to fund its weapon industry, which is private, most of it. Which is, I mean, this is,
I think 75% of it has to go back to the USA. It's a huge handout to Westinghouse and Boeing, is it not? Yeah. While you're drinking, a quick question.
Yeah.
How important then was the development of that alliance in '67, with the fact that the US, that the Vietnamese national liberation movement was defeating the USA, and therefore Israel offers an opportunity to not put American soldiers on the ground? Is that important?
67 is not yet the defeat. It's in 68 that you have a shift in the war in Vietnam. But indeed, the fact that the United States was very heavily involved in Vietnam meant that they would be needing a proxy, a surrogate state in the Middle East in case of big trouble. And that's where the Israeli state became very important in their view. I mean, from the origin, the Israeli state, the Zionist project itself is, by its nature, was a project that couldn't be fulfilled without support by a foreign power, a major power. That is, unlike projections of Britain or other European countries in the form of settler colonialism abroad, here you had a project that was not let's say, the product of a single Western state. So it's a project that didn't have a territorial base, a metropolitan base, if you want, behind it, an imperial metropolis. So they had to seek one. And when the Zionist movement was founded in the late 19th century, they started looking around and to see which of the global powers of the time would provide them with a territory for the fulfillment of their project of a state for the Jews, which is the title of the famous manifesto of Theodor Herzl, the real title. I mean, it's translated the Jewish state, but the correct translation is the state of the Jews. And so they were, although the preference was, of course, for ideological, religious reasons for Palestine, but they were looking everywhere. I mean, they were considering possibility of getting a territory in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, or in Latin America, right? And they also tried, of course, for Palestine, but Palestine was under Ottoman domination, that is Turkish Ottoman domination. And they couldn't get a green light there. And that's where the big shift, the big turning point for the Zionist project was the First World War and British support. When Britain got hold of Palestine and got a mandate, a colonial mandate over Palestine, that's when, in this, it is in this perspective that Britain issued the famous Balfour Declaration in 1917, which was the green light for the Zionist movement. And once a British presence in Palestine was confirmed after the First World War, the Zionist project could start getting implemented at a much larger scale than until that point. Now, why did Britain, I mean, in terms of strategic calculation for the British, that was the idea of having a secure ally in that part of the world close to the Suez Canal, right? At a time when Britain was controlling Egypt and wanting something on the other part to get hold of that. And we see this importance of Israel for British colonialism, for British imperialism for the defense of the Suez Canal, when in '56, when Nasser nationalized this Suez Canal and Israel intervened militarily with France and Britain, right? So this is just to say that from the start, this project was, the nature of the Zionist project made it inevitably as a state, as a belligerent or a military state in the region in a hostile environment, it had to be it had to be allied strategically to a much larger imperial project. So that was the British for some point, then a mixture of European countries, France, Germany, much less Britain at that point, and then the United States. And it's still the United States to this point.
I think it's important for you to underline that, Gilbert. I mean, if a few thousand people came to Scotland or anywhere else and said they had a divine mandate to displace the natives, they would probably be placed in medical care. But if they came with a military force behind them from a superpower, then it would be, I think the original Zionist settlers could have been brushed aside by the Arab resistance, except for the British umbrella. I think that point's worth making at this point, do you not? Yeah.
Yes, of course, that's absolutely right. I mean, even in the late 20s, when you had the first major clashes between the Arab population, the native population, Palestine, and the Jewish settlers. This led to negative migration. That is, after that, the figures of those, the Jews leaving Palestine, those migrants who found that after all, this is not the promised land, I don't want to stay there, and then went out, usually going to what the overwhelming majority of Central European Jews regarded as the promised land, which is North America, the United States. That has always been the preferred destination for migration. So after the first clashes, you had negative migration, but then, of course, Britain, the presence of Britain was what allowed the organized migration to carry on. And then, of course, you had two very major historical events. One is, of course, the power grab by the Nazis in Germany. The advent of Nazi power in Germany was a major turning point in the fulfillment of the Zionist project. We can say that without this, you wouldn't have the state of Israel today, because the migration as it was before 1933 was at a level that would not have succeeded in building a mass of people that would be sizable enough for forcing the creation of a state. So the arrival of the Nazis to power in Germany was crucial. As you know, the Nazis for several years were not in the business of genocide. For several years, they were in the business of ethnic cleansing. It's also a crime against humanity, but let's say a milder one than genocide. So from 33 until 41, basically, even into the war, into the Second World War, Germany organized the migration of German Jews to Palestine, to the point that German secret services worked with the German Zionist movement to help circumvent the limitations on migration that the British authorities had set in the 30s.
Right. Gilbert,
That's one
the fact
event.
that what you're
Just
the fact that what you're saying is the fact that what you're saying is true wouldn't allow you to remain a member of the Labour Party. That's that would be condemned as anti-Semitic. Never mind true, but it's a very dramatic development. You're right. The Havana Agreement, where Germany actually facilitated the colonization of Palestine.
No, I mean,
you can develop that further.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a member of the Labour Party, and well, let anyone try to expel me because of that. Because let me tell you one thing: what I'm stating is history, and I'm stating it in very objective terms. I'm not, you know, saying the Zionists are Nazis or whatever, you know, kind of things like that. But what I'm saying is something. Well, you just take. Well, I already mentioned 2 books. Let me mention a third one by Francis Nicosia, who is a professor of, now is emeritus, of Holocaust studies at the University of Vermont in the United States. He has an excellent book on Zionism and anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. And this is the most scholarly study of this. You find all the documents that you need there. You find a lot of even photographs and all that, explaining in details. Now, of course, he tries to do it in an objective, historical matter, and that's also what I'm saying here. It's a fact. No one can dispute the existence. You can go to Wikipedia and you look for the Havana Agreement of 1933. It was immediately after the Nazis seized power. One of the first things they do is to enter into negotiation with the German Zionist movement, which were for many years the only non-Nazi organization tolerated in Germany, and work with them to organize the migration of German Jews. In fact, the deportation of German Jews by the Nazi authorities to Palestine. Why so? Because Hitler, the Nazis, didn't want German Jews to go to Britain or the United States, even less so, where they would, you know, reinforce the lobbying for an attitude of radical opposition to Nazism, you know. At that point in time, when the Nazis came to power, you had the beginning of a boycott movement, a boycott of Nazi Germany. And the transfer agreement broke this boycott, you know.
Yeah.
The transfer agreement broke this boycott. And the transfer agreement meant what? Meant that German Jews were the only country to which German Jews were able to take their capital, if they were capitalists, if they had money, was Palestine. They could export, or let's say, take with them to Palestine or import into Palestine with them material bought with their German money. And that was the only country. Any other place, they would have to lose everything.
What you're saying is factually incontestable. But Ken Livingstone got into trouble when he was very clumsy in talking about this, and he was constructively expelled from the Labour Party. Is it a step too far, Gilbert, to say that it was effectively an alliance, a very uneven alliance, very brutal relationship, but it was an alliance between the Nazi Germany and the people who ruled the Yishuv, the Zionist colony in Palestine, which helped to break the worldwide Jewish boycott against the Nazi regime. Is that, would you agree with that formula?
Well, the German Zionist movement got into these, the German one, with the Nazis, but of course that was with the full approval of the Zionist movement in Palestine. Let me say that Zionism has always been characterized by a very narrow perspective, where their project of a state in Palestine was the priority preceding any other consideration. if you read Tom Segev, again, that's an author that I hope no one will accuse of anti-Semitism or whatever. If you read his excellent book, The Seventh Million, about the attitude of Israel to the Holocaust, you will see some, for instance, some awful statements by David Ben-Gurion, the key figure in founding the Israeli state, by saying, well, if I could save all children if they could be saved by sending them to Britain, or only half of them by bringing them to Palestine, I would go for the second. You know, a statement like that shows you your scale of priorities. There, it was not humanitarian or anything. The priority was the Zionist project of a state, and everything else was subordinate to that. And that's why also the Zionists were very much fought by other currents within, among European or American or elsewhere Jews, you know, not to mention the Middle East. They were not at all representing the views of everybody, and that's true that they did not, for instance, join or support the demand of open doors in Britain and the United States to the Jews. They did not, the Zionists did not support that, because they were saying, no, Jews should go to Palestine. We're not going to ask London or Washington to open the gates for them, you know? And that was dramatic, absolutely dramatic. You know, I mean, it's well known that, for instance, the only member of the British cabinet who opposed the Balfour Declaration was the only Jewish member of the British cabinet. And he accused the Balfour Declaration of being anti-Semitic. I mean, why do you consider that Jews, I mean, the natural place for Jews would be Palestine? No, we are British, we are French, we are whatever. We are members of the nations to which we belong, of which we, I mean, the language of which we speak and all that. And any consideration of us as kind of people who must have an allegiance today, that's in those terms. Today, the idea, Donald Trump, for instance, would say that US Jews, many of them are not loyal to the state of Israel. So the very idea that because you're Jewish, you have to be loyal to the state of Israel is an anti-Semitic idea. It's plainly so.
Sure.
I mean,
Gilbert, can I take you forward to the present day? I've been reading some of your stuff on the current situation. Just recently, the devastating explosion in Lebanon. But you look at the Middle East today, Iraq has been devastated by the British, by the alliance led by the USA. Syria is, tell me how many civil wars are raging there and how many foreign interventions are waging there, and if they change every week or just every month. Libya, it's a catastrophe of foreign intervention using local pawns. What's the prospect for Palestinian freedom, which exercises many of our viewers, amidst this current situation in the Middle East today? Can you find any glimmers of hope?
Well, I'll be frank with you. I'm not here to sell you something here, Nick. So the situation is gloomy and has been very much so over the last few years for the Palestinian cause in the region. Well, already they have been confronted with a continuous drift to the far right of the Israeli state, which culminated with Benjamin Netanyahu sticking to power since 2009, right? And himself in his alliances and all that, continuously carrying on drifting to the right. Then you had Donald Trump coming, I mean, at the helm of the United States, the most unconditionally supportive of not Zionism, but of far right-wing Zionism, the far right of the Zionists.
White supremacy.
Sorry? Yes.
White
Donald
supremacy.
Trump came there. So that was terrible for the Palestinians. In the meanwhile, you should also say that since 2007, the Palestinians, I would say also with the incitement of the United States, had been split between Gaza and the West Bank. And the split of the movement, which took even the form of a territorial split, has also very much weakened the Palestinians. So if you combine all that, you get to the point where you have this famous deal of the century concocted by Jared Kushner, which is just, I mean, it could have been written by Benjamin Netanyahu. It wouldn't have changed much, because that's exactly the perspective that they want. With, I mean, that is opening the door for a massive annexation of land, of strategic land in the West Bank by Israel, and turning the so-called Palestinian state or statelet or rump state into really, I mean, people used to speak of Swiss cheese, but you know, you have confettis there. You look at that, you see Swiss cheese, but also in those little parts where you have cheese and not holes, you have a lot of little.
So let me ask you another. Can I just ask you another question, because it is complex, yes, and people are conflicted. On the one hand, we would wish to oppose Zionist direct control over any Palestinian village if it can be prevented. But on the other hand, is the so-called annexation, when it takes place, is it such a radical change where the Palestinian president has less power than every Israeli lance corporal or sergeant in the military? How radical, I mean, to what extent should we really be worried about this, and how should we respond to it?
Of course we should be worried about this, because that's a violation of international law. And this part of international law has been a key argument for the Palestinian cause since 1967. That is, even though the Palestinians would regard the state of Israel as it was born after 48 and until 67 to be illegitimate, they were confronted with an international order which regarded those borders as legitimate, okay? Now, with the 67 occupation, there you had even international law, even for Washington, for Paris, for London, for everywhere, these territories were occupied territories, and they are still called occupied territories. Even in international institutions and all that, they are described as such. They are, legally speaking, in international law, occupied territories. Now, when the most powerful state on earth, and one that has a huge influence in all the international institutions, condones the annexation of land, which is the annexation of land seized by force, you know, this is very serious. And that's a very serious blow to the Palestinians. So otherwise, you know, if we follow the logic that you described, and I know some people have this kind of, and it's good that you raised that point, but then it should be the demand that let them, you know, annexate the whole. And of course, that's not what the Palestinian people want. They are against annexation, overwhelmingly. I mean, you know, and this has to be supported, and that's why actually it is very important to denounce any support for annexation, and to exert pressure on all the European governments and the rest to condemn that, to even to, I mean, to reject, for instance, any products imported from occupied land. You know, you have legal arguments that have been used recently in the European Parliament to get some positions which supported boycott with regard to the occupied territories, you know. So you have a number of arguments here. If you relinquish that, you are even, I mean, you are weakening the Palestinian movement and the Palestinian struggle even beyond its present weakness. So no, it's not something that is to be taken lightly or considered as not changing anything. It is very important when states start condoning the annexation by force. I mean, the double standards are fantastic. You know, United States mobilized a huge army, I mean, 500,000 troops to defend this, to so-called defend this, the sovereign, or to liberate Kuwait, right? When it was invaded by Iraq in 1991. At that time, Saddam Hussein, you know, he just said, okay, I withdraw my troops if the Israeli troops are withdrawn from the 67 occupied territories. Of course, no one wanted to even engage in any talk with him about this. Russia annexated Crimea. This is condemned, sanctions, and all that. But this annexation, this occupation, and now of the West Bank and Gaza has been, or the West Bank, essentially Gaza is de facto occupied, although formally speaking, Israeli troops withdrew from within. But it is in a vice. It's a quote. It is in fact a territory under control. It's like a vast open air jail. Yes.
Can I just share something with you and share something with the viewers?
Yes.
You mentioned Ukraine. Following the Russian seizure of the Ukraine, I think there's some popular mandate there from the people in Ukraine. I'm not justifying it. The Scottish government backed a boycott of the Russian Year of Culture, which the UK government had endorsed and planned and worked for. And then the Scottish government followed the UK government in boycotting everything to do with the Russian Year of Culture. They adamantly refused to support any cultural boycott of Israel, despite the seizure of the West Bank, bits of Syria, yes, and so on. Yeah, the hypocrisy in this little parish is so extreme. There's shamelessness. Please continue.
Absolutely, that's well, we've been for so many decades of double standard. Israel is the spoiled child of the Western imperial system. And well, there are various reasons for that. Some, let's say, understandable reasons, which is, for instance, Europe's responsibility in the Holocaust, which creates, of course, out of a wrong, let's say, a wrong assimilation of the lessons of the Holocaust, you end up supporting a state in which you see as the state of the victims or the survivors of the Holocaust, but you then support a state that is going into practices that any real assimilation of the lessons of the Holocaust should lead you to condemn, like occupation, oppression, ethnic cleansing, and the rest, right? In the case of in the case of the United States, we know that one of the reasons is the very powerful role of the pro-Israel lobby. And the pro-Israel lobby, which is not a Jewish lobby, as it is said, actually, the majority, in the opinion of the US population of Jewish descent, is rather critical, much more critical of Israel than this pro-Israel lobby. But the main base, which, for instance, determines the positions of people like Trump and Pompeo, are the so-called Christian Zionists. And those evangelical milieux in the United States who are unconditional supporters of not only of Israel, but the Israeli far right, actually, and out of their own religious views. Also, you know, Christian Zionism played a role even in Britain, in the British Balfour Declaration. That was part of the.
Can I pull you back just a moment? I have a question from a viewer. I think it's harking back to the previous point, Gilbert, if I may. But Jenny Lester, not Jenny from Leicester, Jenny Lester asks, could we not begin to entertain advocacy of a unitary Israel-Palestine without apartheid, equal rights for all, rather than a two-state solution? She's asking you to discourse a little bit on one state versus two states in the light of what you just said earlier.
Yeah. You know, I always say about that it's not for people in Glasgow, London, or New York to, you know, get into harsh debates about one state, two state. the role of people supporting the Palestinian cause is to support the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. It's up to the Palestinians to decide what they want to do. So it's, I think, I mean, sometimes you see hair-splitting debates on these issues and splitting the movement, the solidarity movement, on issues like that. That doesn't make sense, you know. So, I mean, I think that both the idea of one state and the idea of an independent, so-called independent Palestinian state, both of them are utopian. You know, both of them are completely utopian because the Israel, I mean, under the present balance of forces, there is no way the Israeli state would allow for any of these two. And if ever, as Chomsky would put it very rightly, if ever you're going for a one state, that would be a one apartheid state, you know, and probably also link it with a expulsion, a further expulsion of the Palestinians from the West Bank at the very least. So I think that the issue now is to fight for, I mean, in support of the Palestinian struggle for their rights. I think that one important step in that regard for the Palestinians would be to achieve unity on the basis of democracy. That is, instead of splitting their territories and all that, they should be able to, that's a popular demand in Palestine, you know, to end this separation and this division that you have. And that's, there was one step in that direction very recently because they held a meeting in response to the UAE-Israel deal concocted by Washington recently. So you had a meeting of the leaderships of all the Palestinian movements, including Hamas and and Fatah, and that is the Palestinian Authority, in order to agree on some kind of platform. So that's a step, I would say, in the right direction for the Palestinian movement. But the movement abroad, especially in countries that play an important role for Israel in the relation with Israel, like European countries, like this country, like you know, any other, not to mention, of course, the United States, where it's even more obvious. I mean, the movement should be a movement of pressure, I mean, in support of the Palestinian demands, that is, starting with the right to self-determination, the withdrawal of, I mean, the end of occupation, the dismantlement of the settlements, the dismantlement of the separation wall. You know, you have a number of demands, including demands also concerning the Palestinians within the 67 borders who are second-class citizens. The demand that the state should not be defined as the Zionist movement had it through the Knesset recently as a Jewish state, which is excluding from the essence of its citizenship all those 20% of Arabs and other non-Jewish citizens of the state of Israel. So these are the demands that should be supported instead of getting into discussions which are not, I would say, really relevant to people who are outside. Yeah? I mean, I support the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. They formulate their demands, and we support these demands in as much as these demands are legitimate, of course, and that's it.
Yeah, that's our position. But let me, in the time remaining, Gilbert, play to some of your other strengths. We saw huge demonstrations in Algeria recently. I haven't followed it in the last month, but gigantic demonstrations, and you could see Palestinian flags peppering the demonstrations. It seemed that the demonstrators were passionate about Iraq, and the regime presented itself as of Palestine, and the regime presented itself as champions of Palestine as well. Still a lot of life left in Sudan and in Algeria. The UAE public opinion, doesn't seem to support the alliance with Israel. If we look back from between the Mediterranean and the Jordan and look at the entire Middle East, 400 million Arabs or something, surely the road to liberation in Palestine, and I don't mean they wait for other people, because what Palestinians do has an impact across the whole region, but is it conceivable to think of liberation for Palestine without a renaissance, without a transformation of the situation in the Middle East, given the gigantic power of Zionism?
I mean, the power of Zionism itself is not that gigantic. It's the power of Zionism as backed by the United States. The giant there is not Israel, it is the United States. Israel is strong only as a surrogate state for the United States. It's a proxy for the United States, and that's the source of its strength. You know, and that's why also actually the position of the United States is absolutely crucial in determining the position of the Israeli state. There are very narrow limits in which Israel can go against the U.S. will, you know, that's why, I mean, all the movement in support, and the BDS movement, which was a very important step in building up solidarity with the Palestinian people in the most appropriate forms, I would say. That's very important. That's where it is important. Now, if you take the region, of course, I mean, the fact is, however, that if you have a radicalization in the region, this will not diminish the importance of Israel in the eyes of the United States. It will enhance it, because that's the role of Israel. So that's the point, you know. That's why I would say what happens in the United States in the first place can be more important in determining the fate of the Palestinian people under the present historical circumstances than what happens in the Arab region. Now, this is not to say that there is no relevance to what happens in the Arab region. It is definitely important, but still, I mean, the scenario of a war of liberation of Palestine is not something that has to be not something to be contemplated. Israel is a major nuclear power, has been so for many decades, and the idea that you could destroy the Israeli state militarily is just crazy, because even leaving aside the fact that it's backed by Washington, I mean, it wouldn't hesitate resorting to its, why did they accumulate so much nuclear weapons in the first place? And they're estimated to have over 200 nuclear hits. So that's, I mean, so you can't contemplate a war of liberation of Palestine. You have to, I mean, this issue must come from political struggle, mass popular struggle, and solidarity abroad. And that's why I'm saying, and I repeat it here, let's suppose you had Bernie Sanders elected, first chosen as the Democratic candidate in the primaries, and then elected as president of the United States. I can tell you this would have had much bigger impact on the situation of the Palestinian people, because he would have exerted pressure on the Israeli state in the favor of the Palestinians. That would have much more impact on the Palestinian cause that if you have a successful, even if it were the most radical revolution you can think of in Algeria, for instance. Oh, I'm not hearing you, Mick.
That's because I'm an idiot. I was on mute. So, I mean, I disagree with a few things Norman Finkelstein says. One of the things he said a few years ago was, it's not a case of destroying the Israeli state by external military power, but he reckoned that Israel needed to suffer quite a few military defeats in order to make it feel less can I say, arrogant, perhaps ready to negotiate. They won in 73, but they didn't win at the beginning. It was close. Israel didn't win in 2006 in Lebanon. You're Lebanese. I mean, Finkelstein's basically saying Israel needs to suffer a few military defeats before they begin to get a popular opinion that wants to integrate into the neighborhood and not just be an extension of US power. Could you, Gilbert, could you comment on that and make any concluding remarks that you feel you'd like to make?
Sure. No, I wouldn't put it in those terms because, you know, that would mean that we need a few wars, and wars are becoming more and more destructive. And that means more and more killing. And I'm not for any kind of perspective that would entail huge destructions and killing of peoples and all that. I mean, the last wars which was by Israel were terribly murderous. The 2006 war on Lebanon and then the wars on Gaza. Yeah, they were completely very murderous. The rest, I mean, these are territories that, I mean, Lebanon is not a country that can, I mean, the 2006 war failed in achieving what it wanted to achieve, but it destroyed a major part of the country. It's not a military defeat. Even the 73 war, actually, it was stopped at a point when the Israeli army had crossed the canal into the west side of the canal, and you know, going through a circular strategic movement around Cairo itself. I mean, so that was stopped by Washington itself at a point when it would have become disastrous for their friend Anwar Sadat, you know. So no, I mean, Israel is a Sparta. It's indeed, as I quoted the Israeli left-wingers who used to say it's a state, is an army with a state. It's a really Sparta. It's a Sparta kind, like the Greek, the Athenian, the Hellenic Sparta in history, in ancient history, a militarized state with a very high sophistication in the use of weaponry, and the next countries in the region.
Sorry, final question, Gilbert.
Sorry, just let me finish that point. The next states in the region with the important weaponry and all that are all pro-US, you know, clients. All clients of the United States, Egypt, the Saudi Kingdom, and even the United Arab Emirates, which spends a huge lot of money on weaponry. So no, the perspective of the military defeat, it's not that, that's not one that is anyhow. And it's also, where's the agency of the Palestinians in that? No, really, I think what is the path for the Palestinians is a new intifada, like the intifada of 1988, that is an intifada which doesn't fall in the trap of using weapons, but is based on where, you know, it makes sense for the Palestinians in the face of Israel, that is popular struggle, mass popular struggle, and support by the people's movement in Western countries, in those countries that are crucial in support to Israel.
Can I extend our time to ask you two questions?
Please.
Recently, I've been involved in some, I've never fired a shot in anger, and from the comfort of a Scottish, I certainly don't wish war upon anyone. The ideal is to avoid it. But two questions. One, has the Israeli military been degraded by decades of simply abusing Palestinian civilians during the occupation? Does an army that does this for decades still have this tremendous military potential? I guess that's the question. If you could answer that and then make some closing remarks, Gilbert, I'll thank you.
Yeah. No, I mean, the Israeli army, even if you read the book of someone who became an ultra-Zionist like Benny Morris, his book on 1948 will show you that even the first iteration of the Israeli army at the moment of creating the Israeli state was very far from being some kind of moral beacon. That's very far from that. At some point, he even says very bluntly that the Zionist troops perpetrated rapes, much more rapes anyhow than whatever any Arab army perpetrated in that war. There were hardly any on the Arab side. That's what he says. I mean, he's not someone to be suspected again of any hostility to Zionism. So now this army is an army that has been living through, I mean, whatever the ideological pretension, it's an army of occupation. It's an army of defense of a state that was born through occupation. Anyone in that state who wants to see can see, because the traces of that Palestine that was erased by the creation of the Israeli state are still there to see, to whom wants to see, to whom tries to see. And that's the case for quite a number of Israelis who broke with Zionism because of that. So no, the point when the Israeli army had really a moral problem was at the time of the 1988 Intifada, when they were facing masses of people, including not only not armed men, but masses of people, unarmed people, including women, including even young children and all that. And the fact, of repressing that created a moral crisis in the army, very big moral crisis. At that point, you had even retired generals of the Israeli army who advocated the withdrawal from the West Bank, So you see that the impetus of the movement as a peaceful movement, and as one not, across some line like you have in Gaza now, but now, the movement in those territories that were directly controlled by the Israeli army, that was the big moral crisis for the army. And that's why I'm saying this has been the most important phase in the history of Palestinian struggle. The peak of Palestinian struggle is 1988. That is when the Intifada, the first one, which started in December 87, and peaked in 88. That was the peak. And that created a tremendous moral crisis in the Israeli state, including big demonstrations, big part of the public opinion against continuing the occupation. So that's what should continue to be done. Unfortunately, Yasser Arafat, chose the path of relying upon the Washington and the goodwill of the Zionist movement through the Oslo Agreement, which turned out to be exactly like have been predicted, and some predicted that, me, myself included, at the beginning from 1993. This was, a sham. This was a complete, yeah, and that's the point. It is the popular struggle backed by the popular movement, the justice movement, if you want, the pro-justice movement in Western countries. That's the combination of these two that is the most crucial. Of course, you can add to that what happens in the Arab environment, but I would say the most crucial is the struggle of the Palestinians themselves and that of in the West. Plus, I would make a special mention of Jordan, because the Jordanian state is actually one which is inhabited by a majority of Palestinians who are treated also as second-class citizens. And we have to also say that. That's also part of the oppression of the Palestinian people. And that's another very important element of the struggle, because if you have a radical change in Jordan, that would be a tremendous support for the Palestinians in the West Bank, and that also would be, a very radical, very qualitative change in the landscape.
Gilbert Achcar, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to come and be interviewed and chat with us today. I think you've left a trace. We'll follow up on some of this. People are asking about your earlier books. We'll share information about. But again, thanks for a very stimulating discussion, Gilbert. And,
you're welcome. Thank you.
I hope maybe sometime in the future. We've run out of time. I had another half dozen questions to ask you, but perhaps sometime in the future we can have you back again.
Sure, anytime. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks again, Gilbert. I've got a couple of announcements to make, as well as thanking Professor Achcar. We went to Hampden Stadium on Friday when Scotland was playing Israel, and we had a very interesting protest, a lot of support. And by chance, this is a quirk, Israel plays Scotland again in the same stadium in 5 weeks' time, actually on Thursday, October the 8th. And we will be mobilizing a protest for that football game. Israel can no longer send any artistic state-sponsored groups to the Edinburgh Festival. They always get protested out. We need to repeat the successes of cultural boycott here in the sporting area as well. And I'm hoping next week we'll interview somebody from South Africa where we'll discuss the significance of the sporting boycott in contributing to the downfall of Israeli apartheid, and the lessons that we can learn for solidarity with the people of Palestine today. So please keep in touch, leave your details, and we'll be in touch. We'll have a mobilizing meeting shortly for October the 8th. But once again, it's my great pleasure, Mick Napier, on behalf of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, thanking Professor Achcar for joining us, and thanking above all viewers and listeners for joining us as well. Take care, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.